Hey, welcome to the bonus content for our Summer on the Mount series. This has been an awesome start as we've been kicking off in the Beatitudes. And if you have not yet watched part 3, where we looked at "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," I'm finishing that message. And so go back and watch that first part now. We are looking at 5 marks of a meek disciple. And so our Sunday message focus on the first 3, and I'm going to finish out the last 2. So for those of you who've been taking notes on your app, pull that out. You can finish those blanks and have some closure in your life, right? You can finish some of those blanks there. And so we're looking at, we talked about on Sunday in part 1 of our message that Jesus was finishing some teaching from David in Psalm 37. And so David was talking about the meek. And remember, Jesus is saying, hey, the meek will inherit. And that word inherit means that you're gaining something because of who you know. Not because of what you did, but because of who you know. But we also looked at the inheritance is not something that is instant. Often it takes a long time to receive that inheritance. And as a disciple of Jesus, we're not taking this instant gratification approach to life. We're looking long term because there's blessing and there's inheritance for those who follow Jesus. And so I want to share with you number 4, number 5 of these 5 marks of a meek disciple. And we find going back to Psalm 37, here's what David writes in verse number 7. He says, "Be silent before the Lord and wait expectantly for him. Do not be agitated by one who prospers in his way, by the person who carries out evil plans." David liked to write that phrase, "do not be agitated," a lot in this passage, and he writes it again in our next point. But here's the 4th mark of a meek disciple, and that is this. It's the word expect. Expect. They stay in silence. They stay in silence. Now, I love what David writes. He says, "Be silent before the Lord." Have you ever tried to be silent for a while? Like if I were to freak you out right now of watching this, then we would just be silent for the next 60 seconds. And I bet you would click off this video because you couldn't handle it. As a youth pastor, one time I was talking with our students about being silent before the Lord, this very passage, and we did an experiment where we tried to stay silent for 60 seconds altogether. Now, if you have ever tried this with other people, it is nearly impossible, especially with teenagers. But you know what happened was that if you can push through some of the awkwardness of that silent, of those moments where nothing is going on, you really can hear from the Lord in a powerful way. And so David is saying, be silent before the Lord. You know, our world is too noisy. We've got notifications every few seconds on our phone. We've got emails. We've got texts. We've got phone calls, voicemails. There's so many things that are coming at us. And maybe you have Slack for your business, or even you do messaging for your work. And there's so many messages that come our way that it is very hard in our current society to stay silent. But if we're going to be a meek disciple, what that means is we have to sit silent and be silent before the Lord in a very noisy world. And so maybe in your own work week, or maybe at home watching the kids, or maybe in your commute, you can carve out some time where you can be silent before the Lord. There's an old story in the Old Testament where Elijah, the prophet, was trying to hear the voice of God, and thunder was coming, and large noises were coming, but God's voice wasn't there. And you know what came in for God's voice? It was a whisper. And people say that God was speaking in a whisper to draw Elijah close to him. And God wants you to be silent so that you would draw close to him. But then David writes not only to be silent for the Lord, I love this next word because he says, wait expectantly for him. I love that word expectant. It's kind of this other idea of anticipate, where we're expecting God to do some great things. You know, we talk about mothers who are expecting their child, right? I remember with my 2 daughters being born, there was this expectation that the moment that they were born, and it was this moment that I'll never forget because it was this, you've been expecting this for several months now, and you've been waiting for that arrival. And it's that same kind of tone where we're expecting God to do some great things. But it's only going to come in the silence because we, as meek disciples, we're expecting, but we're going to stay in the silence. Remember, we looked at in part 1, a key word for a meek disciple is that they stay. And so we're going to stay in silence. While the world is going crazy, while the world is having lots of noise and lots of notifications and interruptions, as a meek disciple, we're going to stay silent and we're going to expect God. We're going to anticipate God to do some great things in our life. And so let me encourage you as we're thinking about this idea of being a meek disciple, that we say, God, okay, I'm going to sit silently before you, and I'm going to expect you to answer this prayer. I'm going to expect you to do this miracle in my life. And like we talked about in part 1, we're not giving God a list of our demands and we're saying, okay, God, here's what I need you to do, because God's going to give us the desires of our heart as we stay in his presence. But we're going to anticipate that God's going to meet those needs. He's going to grant those requests. He's going to give us the desires of our heart because we are sitting in silence. Well, there's a fifth characteristic that we find, a fifth mark of a meek disciple in Psalm 37. And here's what David writes as he finishes out this passage of Scripture. He says in verse number 8, he says, refrain from anger and give up your rage. And then he says this phrase again, do not be agitated. I wonder if David was agitated himself, and so he's having to write these multiple times in this passage to remind himself, don't be agitated. It's like David maybe putting that on the mirror as he's getting ready, or on the refrigerator, or in the car dash, where he's trying to remind himself, okay, don't be agitated, don't be agitated. And then he says, when you're agitated, it can only bring harm. And then in verse number 9, he says, for evildoers will be destroyed, but those who put their hope will inherit, there's that word again, inherit the land. And then he says in verse number 11, he says this, and Jesus paraphrases this in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, but the humble, the meek, remember the gentle, the considerate, the courteous, they will inherit the land. And then David goes a step further and says they will enjoy abundant prosperity. Good things are coming to those who are meek, to those who are humble, to those who are gentle, considerate, and courteous. And so as we think about this last mark, here's what it is. It's the word restrain. And what this means is that the meek disciple will stay away from harm. Stay away from harm. Now that word restrain means to hold back. It means that while that decision or that environment or that party or that relationship or you fill in the blank may look fun and entertaining and pleasureful, what you're gonna hold back though, because you're looking for just a temporary moment of happiness. But as a meek disciple, remember, we're thinking long view. So while it may bring some joy in the moment, we're going to stay away from harm because we know that we are called to a higher calling. We're called to live a more abundant life that is away from the temporary joys or happiness or pleasures of sin. Now, sin is pleasurable for a season. There's no doubt about that. There's things that you and I can do that maybe are not illegal, but maybe they're immoral, or maybe they're fun to our flesh, and we can experience some pleasure for a moment. But a meek disciple says, I'm going to refrain, I'm going to restrain, I'm going to hold back from the harm that I know that will give to me. Because remember, we're looking at the inheritance that God has for us. And when we live just for our own self or to our own pleasure, what we're saying is, God, I don't trust you in the future. I need to do what's best for me right now. And so as a meek disciple, we're going to focus. We're going to say, God, I'm going to stay away from the harm. I'm going to stay in silence, and I'm going to anticipate that you've got some great things for me. And so as we think about this idea of a meek disciple, those that are humble, that are gentle, kind, courteous, how are you? I mean, we've looked at in part 1, focus and trust. We looked at delighting in God's presence. And today we added 2 more in that expectation as well as that restraining ourselves from harm. What area, what avenue as a meek disciple do you need to focus on? Do you need to stay in? Maybe you've been doing some self-harm, maybe physically, but also emotionally. Maybe you've been in an emotionally or even verbally abusive relationship that you're like, I need to stay away from that. Maybe you've been allowing the evil one to plant thoughts and to put maybe people along your path that are causing you great harm. Maybe you need to restrain from them and stay away from the harm that is causing you. Many times we get caught up in things because that's just the way that we've always done it, or that's just the way it's always been, or they've always been in my life, or I've always thought this way. But we need to restrain from those things that are causing us harm because we're moving into the life that God's called us to. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. It's all about this countercultural life that is this amazing path that God has for us if we're willing to submit to his plans and follow his will. And so as a meek disciple, we focus. As a meek disciple, we trust. As a meek disciple, we delight. But then as a meek disciple, we expect, we anticipate what God's called us to because we're going to restrain from things that are going to cause us harm. And so let me encourage you as a rooted disciple of Jesus that you incorporate, that you bring into your life this meekness. Remember, meekness is not weakness. It's true strength in knowing who you are and whose you are, because you are a child of God. You are a son or a daughter of the Most High, and He loves you more than anything that you can ever possibly experience on this earth. He has a life for you that is beyond your wildest imaginations if you were just to give Him your life and give Him your path and say, God, I don't know all the steps, but I'm going to follow you. I'm going to trust in you, and I'm going to anticipate that you have a great plan for my life. Remember, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit. They will gain something that they don't have, not because of what they've done, but because of who they know. They will inherit the earth. So let me encourage you as we're moving into the Sermon on the Mount throughout this summertime, that you become a meek disciple rooted in Jesus. Thanks for watching. God bless.